opening of the India's consulate in Seattle mean to Indian American tech professionals? Is there a way where we can work together? Can we and you help each other mutually? The other one was on how do you as the tech community view this story of the India promise, particularly after the elections and what the media calls the Modi 3.0 governance, and what's the space there looking back in terms of opportunities arising from here. And the third piece which I'd like to focus on was how does the India-US partnership, which is characterized by the president himself as the most consequential relationship of the 21st century, how does that stack up in terms of tech professionals contributing to the nature of the bilateral relationship? So with that said, on the first one, let me say that to us, the setting of this consulate was basically a decision at the highest levels of the government last year in July 2023, when between the Prime Minister and the US President, it was decided that for the next 2 decades at least, the defining centerpiece of India-US partnership is going to be technology. And even amidst technology, they spelled out a very specific domain called critical and emerging technologies. And critical and emerging technologies were not left to the spectrum of what you just look in the IT space itself. It was a very wide canvas which could cover space technologies, it could cover critical minerals, it could cover semiconductors, it could cover obviously things like artificial intelligence and quantum computing. The Greater Seattle area is an established hub of companies on the Pacific Northwest, and therefore our presence in this region was aimed to bolster the high-tech dimension of this critical and emerging technologies. That's what eventually pushed us to come immediately and set the operationals going. What you also know is, given the nature of operations that are happening in the Pacific Northwest, whether it's in the aerospace industry, whether it's what's happening between Boeing and India, a lot of what is happening is intrinsically linked to some of the work happening in the research labs in Bangalore, Hyderabad, and the movement of manpower. And that also needs a kind of a government backbone architecture to facilitate at both ends. That's why very soon you will be seeing US also opening 2 new consulates in India, hopefully in that part of South India. And we are already here to make that bridge as seamless as possible. This is India's 6th consulate in the United States. We were earlier present in New York, San Francisco, Chicago, Atlanta, and Houston. So on this part of the equation, which is what do our presence mean to the tech industry, I would say you are here, perhaps the best minds and brains from India, who have picked up some of the finest practices in the tech operating space. And if you think there are expertise areas or particular areas where India in its present state could benefit, please pass on those ideas to us and we'd be happy to take them forward. And I must acknowledge there has been very good communication between members of the TIE and the consulate. We had this very good proposal about setting up a center for AI excellence in India, come from one of your members. And it's very, very positively taken by our Ministry of Information and Technology, and work is already underway on that proposal. So there are things that we could do together. If we have concrete concept notes, proposals, feasibilities shared with us, we'd be happy to connect that going forward. Coming to the second aspect of what I wanted to speak to you, how does the India story stack up in the aftermath of the elections? Well, to the Indians here in the audience, most of us spent a sleepless night of 3rd June and 4th June watching the figures come up. Depending on which side of the spectrum you were, somebody would have been happy, somebody would have been unhappy. But the larger point I want to say, and where I would like you to look at the India's full picture of the democratic growth story, is in terms of the numbers and the manner in which this election was conducted. Again, also please remember that democracy is a shared chord which the India and US always put as a front label when we talk about the bilateral relationship. So the things that you should always keep in perspective, particularly following from the aftermath of the elections, I would say, is the beauty of Indian democracy. There were close to 2,680 political parties who were contesting the 2024 general elections. No other country in the world has a political canvas that gives opportunity to 2,680 competing political parties throughout its length and breadth, which includes an electorate of the size of 998 million people. That's the size of the election challenge or the democratic masterpiece that was conducted in India over the last 1 month. Just for your information, the first time voters this time were close to 1.8 crore. Now, how much would that be in million? I think about 18 million or something. First time voters. And another 19 million of the total voters were in the age group of 20 to 25. Young 19 million voters who participated. There were 85 lakh, which is 8.5 million first-time female voters who were exercising their right to vote. 8.5 million female first-time voters who participated. And since we are sitting in Washington, which is traditionally been a democratic state, we must also remember the kind of facilities that were extended in this democratic process. People with disabilities who were facilitated by the state machinery to cast vote. When I say facilitated with state machinery, the district magistrates in cities were authorized to make sure that there are. India had introduced in 2014 as part of its electronic voting machine a button called Nota, which is none of the above. It gave people the option to express their anger. They didn't like any of the people who were on the fray, and it was supposed to be an expression of people's anger. This year, in this election, in Indore, 184,000 people pressed the Nota button. Imagine 184,000 people queuing up to cast their vote, which is rejecting candidates on the plate. Two electronic voting machines, which thankfully with the results this time, even the opposition doesn't contest its integrity, its sanctity, and getting the results on the same day. So I would rather say that when you look immediately at what are the gains, please keep these stats in mind. Please keep the beauty of the Indian elections in mind. Again, we have continuity in our leadership. This will ensure that the direction of economic reforms or the direction of our economic growth rate stays the course as it has so far. And when I talk about the economic direction, I'm pretty sure that it is going to be a firm, decisive government which will take this economic trajectory further forward. We clocked a GDP growth rate of 8.4% last quarter. Global average GDP growth rate, as you are aware, is in the low 3%. India is doing 8.4%. So the opportunity there is significant in terms of economic growth going forward. Another point I also want to say, because climate change and these energy issues are very, I would say, a very key agenda in the discourse here. Please remember in mind, India is the only G20 country to have met its Paris goals, the Paris commitments, 7 years ahead of the 2030 schedule. We reached our 2020 Paris commitment in 2020. And while we became the world's fastest growing economy, we grew our solar capacity in the last 5 years by 2,300%. India grew its solar capacity by 2,300% in the last 5 years. And again, it's a factually correct statistic which is not our data, but it's a UN-based data for you to observe. So in terms of scale and numbers, I would say the India story is a very promising story. It's the most, I would say, at least in that part of Asia where we are, a story which inspires hope. And I would say it's driven by a backbone of young, aspiring people. I got this data, I think, yesterday, where if I remember correctly, we are now doing close to 260,000 computer science graduates a year. 260,000 computer science graduates a year. Our young population, which is less than 35 and between 20 and 35, is 65% of our population. And the next best thing which I would like you all to take away from today is in terms of the canvas of the digital public infrastructure in India that has happened in the last 5 years, which I would say, again, as tech professionals, your counterparts in India have had contributed immensely to it. But it's the most fascinating story for any developing country to put forward in such a short time frame. People who have lived in India till say 4 years back would testify that we were largely a cash-dependent economy. There are many cities in India who have transitioned, tier 2, tier 3 cities, from a cash-based economy to an entirely phone payment system without going through the credit card or debit card phase of the banking system at all. So when we look at digital payments in India and its global stats, every second digital payment in the world, happens in India, every 1 out of 2. We have close to 850 million smartphone and internet users, 850 million smartphones and internet users. And India is expected to be a $1 trillion digital economy by 2026. How much did we spend in developing this Aadhaar or the digital backbone or linking the UPI to the digital ID cards? Roughly on this scale, the expenditure translated to close to $1 per person, all put together, where this has been mapped out to. And with that scale of economy kicking in, I'm very happy to inform you that there are 16 countries of the global south, when I say global south, which means the developing countries, who are now using
switched my major to computer science. My father was like, can't really afford your education. Here's a $2,000 and a plane ticket, and that was really my journey to the US.
Wow, that's great. So you've started many companies, and we focus our discussion primarily on Apptio. But what made you decide to become an entrepreneur in the first place, with your first company?
Yeah, so my journey was after graduating with computer science and math. I worked for IBM, interestingly enough. My first job was working for IBM as a software developer. And a couple of years into that journey, I felt the career was going really slow. And I had so many people around me who had been career IBM people, who had been there for 20 years, 30 years. And so a couple of years into it, I was like, I know I don't want to be that. So let me try to do something. So anyway, I ended up at another software company, and then one day I was 26. That was my first company called Bigger Technology. So a bunch of us kind of woke up and just said, hey, I'm going to quit my job and start it was a consulting company which ended up morphing into a software company. We were only there for a couple of years. There was no venture, made all kinds of mistakes. And then we ended up selling it to a company, Rational Software, which ended up moving me to Seattle. So that was really, just really looking at the career trajectory and saying, how do I accelerate that journey was really my, was my desire for entrepreneurship.
So you said you made a number of mistakes at that time. Do you remember any of the key mistakes, and what advice would you have for entrepreneurs?
Yeah, in now that was way back. So really, I look back at time. So we were kind of consulting and then using consulting to kind of fund the product, but I really didn't know how to create a product company. Didn't really truly understand the value of kind of customer validation at that time. So that would be the number one thing. I probably just not a lot of customer validation, just really thinking about, okay, this is what the market needs versus really perfecting the product market fit. And the second area I think of mistakes were really around the team construction. Like everybody else in the company was kind of more like me versus bringing in truly more complementary skills, which would accentuate my background. And the third thing I realized, Sirosh, was I didn't know what I didn't know, and so I just needed to go through experience at a larger company to learn these skills, and it was too early to be an entrepreneur. I would have probably never succeeded at that company, so thankfully it got sold pretty early and allowed me to kind of just develop my skills at Rational Software, which was a perfect around 1,000-person company. And I was able to kind of learn a lot of skills around go-to-market, product, customer validation, which then later in my life allowed me to do my second company.
Got it. Yeah. So your second company was I Conclude, which was sold to Offsware, and then Offsware became part of Packard. So do you feel that you did a better job the second time around in terms of avoiding some of those mistakes?
Yeah, the second time basically stayed at Rational for a long time. And ironically, Rational also ended up being owned by IBM. So I ended up leaving there and then joined Madrona as a VP of Marketing and Business Development. And
and actually successful at a wide range of tasks. And that is not the next 6 months, that's easily the next 10 years. The second one I would say is there are some mega applications. Biology is the one that comes to mind, right? We've got protein design, we've got medicine and so on, and those are going to be revolutionized. Microsoft is one of the leaders there, there are many others. So how do you take AI and completely revolutionize biology? Next 25 years, you're going to see that. And then the last one, and I'll stop, is the tying these models, which are unreliable, which are kind of fuzzy, but also exciting, to action, right? So the last thing you want to do right now is let ChatGPT not just say a bunch of stuff, but actually use your credit card, right? That's an example of an action. Or drive a robot, because periodically it'll buy, things you didn't anticipate, like I don't know, Boeing 747, depending on your credit limit, right? Or it'll periodically, it'll do a great job of this, periodically drive the tractor off the cliff, et cetera, et cetera. So tying these models to action, to actual physical action in the real world, or action that has consequences like using a credit card, extremely complex problem for the future.
Thank you, Oren. Now, I want to come back to something you said earlier about the opportunities for startups, big companies, and so on. And one of the things that a lot of people are betting on is open source models. Should we be betting on them? Do you think they'll catch up with the big proprietary ones from OpenAI, Gemini, and Cloud?
Yes. I can say more too. The key is that there is a giant in Meta pouring corporate levels of cash into an open model, Loma family of models, $15 billion of OpEx a year, not all of which is going to Llama itself. And the calculus there is very simple. Mark Zuckerberg has promised to himself that he would never again allow himself to have a platform underneath him that he did not control. This is why he's bet so heavily on Oculus, come hell or high water. Should he be an OpenAI customer? He would be the biggest one. Never, not in a million years. So Mark has a 3-step plan. Number 1, make sure Sam Altman does not have power. Number 2, try and get some power for Mark. Number 3, maybe monetize down the road. And he has, nation state levels of cash to be able to do that. There are open questions about exactly what open means and exactly what will be the community's role in all of this, and there are some other open models too. But here are $15 billion a year and some of the brightest minds in the industry being applied to build models that are freely available for commercial use by almost anybody, with an explicit intention to meet and beat those of the proprietary models.
Thank you. An extension of that open source question is, historically, as far as technology is concerned, open source was what brought everybody else outside the rich countries up. It enabled a whole lot. I think, Vijay, you talked in the past about AI having the potential for the global south to leapfrog past, and not just the global south. I mean, even here, it feels like poor kids are able to now create code, do a bunch of things, start their own business. They're getting opportunities that only rich kids had access to, and then same with countries. Like the global south has access now to technology that allows them to leapfrog. Tell us a little bit more about some real examples of how people are using that and what are the challenges standing in the way.
So I'm going to exclude China, which is typically not considered global south. I'm going to exclude India because it's got, even though resources are low, expertise levels and ability to pivot large scale venture is there. So I'm spending a lot of time, firstly with African nations and their governments and of course national bodies, and also people who you would consider global south but are resource rich, like the Gulf countries and countries like Chile that have become very rich because of lithium and so on. What comes across all of these is this. In the West, you think we'll be better when we have less hunger, our people are better educated, we have better health care. That's very patronizing. We aspire to dignity, we aspire to be leaders. We aspire to get to high-tech innovation, manufacturing and research, leapfrogging the garment manufacturing stage, the call center stage. How do we get there? So basically, yes, all those other things will happen, but nobody's willing to put their career, if you're a senior enough person, behind, catch up to the West. That is not really the game in town. The game in town is leapfrog right now. So the kinds of things that are happening, so just like in India, there has been a tradition of education, and even before IITs, Jamshedji schools and so on. Look at a country like Senegal. Pasteur Institute has been there for 100 years. They have those people trained. They didn't have the infrastructure to create a manufacturing plant for biologics. How do I get expertise from Sanofi in Paris, which operates at a very expensive equipment with power supply which is constantly available with ingredients which are highly pure, and people who are 15 years expert? Can you adapt me to work on that leading edge by up-leveling my skills, by allowing me to operate with variable quality? So that's really what I see. I'm generalizing, of course, from probably a sample of 15, 20 sort of countries, and Africa is very large, and Global South is larger. But I do not see any traction right now for people saying, you know what, you are poor, we'll make you slightly better. I see zero traction for that.
I wanted to build on a couple of points that both of you. Look, and this connects to Paul. AI today creates challenges because the marginal cost is not zero. Let me explain what I mean. In the world of open source, if you were creating the next MySQL database, Postgres database, Kubernetes, whatever it is, any developer with a PC could just work it. There was no marginal cost to writing more software. But if Llama's 400 billion comes to you from Meta, what are you going to do with it? How are you going to run it? How much cost is there to experiment with these very, very large models? And most people can't do anything about it. And in some ways, even when I worry, these are all concerns, let's say the South, the rest of the poor countries. Well, let's say they want to leapfrog in AI. but what infrastructure are you going to have to use to be able to leapfrog? Now you have to assume there will be a bunch of innovation that it has low marginal cost. You have to hope for it. But today's state of the world is whoever has the money to have the infrastructure and that privileged access to that as a absolutely crazy advantage that's so hard for anyone else to tackle.
So, just what I would say is this. Just like the jagged edge where you can find value in imperfect solutions, there's a jagged edge where you can find incredible value even in the cost of AI the way it is. So actually AI is cheaper than most of the technologies were early on. PCs were too expensive for most people. Phones, the world wasn't feature phones. Right. This got cheap. And the key here is that when we design applications in the West, we design them without thinking about the cost. Oh, 1 million token window. That's wonderful, isn't it? Huge amount of RAG. No, pre-process. Google, Bing, they count pennies. They do not apply the AI for running every query. They pre-process, they do batch, so there are plenty of smart ways of lowering the cost, but the key is to find very high value opportunities.
Now you created, set the stage for just how much potential there is for AI to just have, for Global South to...
Is you're going to understand the future a lot better.
So something that has been not articulated yet, I also think AI is a new medium. So printing press created a book, radio created radio shows, film created movies, streaming created YouTube. I think AI is a new way of representing information, communicating knowledge, and interacting with it. So it is a super medium. It can take all of the other media, and it can generate multimodal, all the other media as well. So I think of leveraging, and I think all of you should think of it also as a new technology to leverage, not just to create efficiency, but to communicate. So I can explain more later.
He has a whole company.
Yes.
Which I'm a huge fan of, actually. So I would say there's a famous line I'm sure many of you have heard: you're not going to be replaced by AI, you're going to be replaced by people who understand how to use AI for your job much better. So to me, what that means is that John's point is so important that I want to take my 2 sentences and underline it. If you're not spending an average of an hour a day using the latest AI tools, you are falling behind. So my advice to you is, whatever you're doing, whether it's travel planning or your job or coding, you better be playing at least with ChatGPT, Gemini, the equivalent, in doing that and figuring out that stuff. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the wonderful talk.
Thank you so much at the panel. Really appreciate it.
Does he have a future? Meaning of my question. So I said, let's, when we get out to play, talk about it and get more data-driven approach. So basically, we have the collection of resumes, people who studied art history at USC. You could say if they graduated 5 years ago, what are they doing? They graduated 10 years ago, what are they doing? So basically, with a tremendous amount of data that is available, okay, that can be that data. Now, a lot of you with high school kids approach me later on. I can help with that analysis. It's easy to do. So that somehow led us to how put that same analysis into that. But we are continuously having to do many pivots, so then, the we grew like a, hyper exponentially, and then 2 years ago when the economy and all the talent, tech companies stopped hiring, laid off their recruiters, what are we going to do? So we said, of course, it's not about just talent acquisition, it's about talent holistically. What are the people you already have? So it was about, talent you recruit, how do you retain, how do you grow, redeploy, all of those things become issues. So, we do that, and so we are continuously repivoting in some ways as the world changes around us.
I think newsflash, I sit on the public company board and some other boards as well, and I think the world is a continual pivot. Everything is changing rapidly, and so the skills that you were learning in Startup Plan will serve you well, regardless of what you do next. And as you continue to grow and become, hopefully someday a public company, or at least get to make that choice whether you want to be a public company or not. It is the nature of the beast in today's world.
Yeah, I think Heather and Anup said it really well in that every early stage company is a series of weekly pivots. If you aren't doing that, I think by definition you're probably missing some important signal somewhere. We had a lot of those in both of my companies, but in the second one we certainly had one major pivot in product strategy that was driven by listening to the customer frequently. We were building a marketplace for private equity, so basically a stock exchange but for private companies. And we've done a lot of customer interviews and spent a lot of time understanding customer demand and behavior. Both the sellers, employees at large companies, Facebook at that time was private, and investors wanted to trade. There was very clear interest and demand from both sides, but yet getting those trades to happen was really, really difficult. And that led us to doing a lot more customer interviews, understanding customer pain, and asking the right questions. We learned that the big challenge was one of an information gap, that the sellers knew a lot more about the company than the buyers did, which is not the case in public equities. And that resulted in us pivoting the company to becoming much more of a research company, of making information a little bit more accessible, bridging the gap or reducing the friction to get the buyers to eventually buy. And I think it's very much a part of constant customer validation, constant customer conversations, and trying to see if your product meets that.
Thank you. Yeah, not a lot of companies are able to go from like a messaging app to a talent acquisition tool. So that's speaking of skills and new markets and ideas, these days it looks like every idea has to be an AI idea. I don't know how much of that is a hype, but in general, do you have in keeping with the theme of the topic as well, sort of tools for entrepreneurs who are looking in this market, from an idea perspective, and then something to avoid, from a risk or other thing that they should keep in mind, especially in context of AI? Maybe you can start with Vivek.
Sure. I feel like I'm going to allude a lot to the previous panel, but Oren said this really, really well. I think as this technology advances a lot more, that the need for unique insight and under deep domain expertise or understanding of a specific vertical or problem or customer becomes the most important thing. So to me, this may be very specific to me, but to me it's just much more about that. And as this technology somewhat levels the playing field as far as the technology goes, I think where you can develop an edge is that understanding of a market and the research that you can do, understanding the customer problem. As I guess a counter to that, the don't would be over branding in AI. I think that shows you as an unserious company and unserious people. And I think serious investors and more importantly, serious customers will really see through that. And I think that's not the brand you want to build. I think if you are speaking to customers, it's really important talking about what you can do rather than the general technology.
Heather?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, we started out with an AI thesis when we started the firm, and of course we've now watched the entire VC world pivot into AI, which has been even including Web3 companies and crypto companies and everybody else, and so we've seen this not only in the startup world but also in the venture capital world, and I think it's a real mistake. And we ourselves have recognized that AI will become a non-thesis in the relatively near future, just like cloud has become a non-thesis from an investment standpoint, because it's become sort of table stakes, right? So I think that there is still an importance to AI depending on what your product is and what your market is, and we tend to invest in things that are very highly centered around AI and require a lot of AI expertise, and so we do not treat the AI as being sort of a given. We treat it as being very central to the product, and this has evolved over time because, of course, the field has gotten much more developed and the nature of the startups have gotten much more sophisticated. But I think there's plenty of room for people who are treating it as a basic building block of any technology startup and are really concentrating on their specific domain expertise in that particular market. So it really depends on your company, but one of the credibility mistakes you could make, back to the point that Amit made, was if you overbrand on AI and are really trying to say, you're all about AI, but really you're about serving a particular customer with a particular business service, and it's just garden variety AI that any company would have just as part of their backbone of tech and their tech stack, you can really lose a lot of credibility just to
What we're going to talk about today is that cumulative impact that can come about because you can use your mind, your talent, and your know-how, and bring that into the service of others and not just for yourself. So the panels that we've heard from earlier kind of alluded to this whole issue of technology and empathy. And what you're going to hear today from our panelists is around empathy and the applications of empathy that actually leads to societal change and improvements of hundreds of millions of lives, if not billions. So with that, I would like to introduce Dr. Raman, who's the chairman in Sustainable Growth, but is also one of the people that have been involved with Wheels, and he's going to talk more about Wheels and what is Wheels all about. Mr. Ratan Agarwal, who is the president of the Wheels Foundation, the global foundation, and of course our friend, our community leader, Arpita Agarwal, who's the founder of MEQ Software and the amazing work that she and her husband Rajiv, who's also here, are doing in improving the lives of young people in India through the applications of technology. So with that, please join me in welcoming our panelists, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Ram.
Thank you very much. Because I cannot see those slides sitting here, I'm going to have to stand, and you guys can't see me if I sit down anyway. All right. As you probably see, a little bit of a background on who I am. Friends, I'm Ram Ramanan, and thank you, Akhtar, for this wonderful introduction. I don't know if it actually does justice, because we may have said too much about me and very little is there to say. Anyway, in 2006, you see in the picture there, you recognize the person, Kapil Sibal. He used to be in charge of all the IITs, so we are all kind of somewhat indebted to him. Oh, can you all hear me? Wonderful. 2006 is when Abdul Kalam challenged us IITians. You got a $500,000 education. You have 500,000 of you. And what are you giving back as Guru Dakshina to the country and the school? What are you giving back as a give back to society per se? So that was the driver for him. Luckily, earlier that year, I was fortunate to get a US government Fulbright scholarship the same year to go and create an awareness of sustainability in India. And I went to India, was very fortunate to teach at IIT Bombay. I also got a chance to speak at every IIT and every IIM, essentially creating what I would call an awareness of sustainability. I was very fortunate. Of all the people I did meet, Anand Mahindra.
When built and deployed to the scale needed over here, among the top scale, can you talk about, from your vantage point, where do you see this is trending? What is the future you see? How is the trend looks like for you?
So I think as much as we want to kind of avoid talking about AI, it is a major part of the infrastructure. It is kind of big. One of the things that I've been kind of thinking about is kind of at this point, the world's GDP is about $100 trillion. IT spend is about 10% worldwide, so $10 trillion. And I believe kind of what we are seeing with AI, we probably have the potential to kind of increase the world's GDP by an additional $10 trillion over the next 5 to 6 years. So adding like 1 percentage point in GDP worldwide for the next few years. So I think it's a big deal. I suspect the overall kind of financial impact of AI and related technologies is going to be to the tune of what we've done with all the technology so far. So I think it's a huge kind of change in how we operate. I was here when 94, 93 when Netscape did the browser, and 2007 or 6 when Apple brought touch to the phone. And both those events really changed life. Like the way we thought about anything, it changed after that. And I think this is an equal kind of sea change. So I suspect that it's going to contribute majorly to kind of what we do. Yesterday, I went to my doctor, and just routine kind of visit, talk about a bunch of things, and he says, what we are doing today is I'm going to be using this technology called DAX from Nuance. And that's going to transcribe our whole conversation, and it's going to kind of keep notes, etc. So you and I can have a discussion, and usually when I go to the doctors, they're kind of busy typing on the terminal, they kind of ask you a couple of questions, whatnot, but this was like, wow, the experience is totally different. I feel like I'm really at the center of this. And the reason they can do that is because they are kind of offloading a bunch of the mundane work to a somewhat intelligent agent that's basically going to do it for them. And so I think the whole experience of kind of going to the doctor kind of changed dramatically for me. Okay. I'm sure you guys talked about Khan Academy earlier, and I think like just the ability to have a personalized tutor for every kid in the world, and it adjusting dynamically to the level of competence or the level of skill set that they have is something we just can't do with human power.